Thanks to the success of R-rated superhero stories, such as the Deadpool movies and the Joker film, which is actually the highest grossing R-rated film of all time, executives have finally realised there is a market for R-rated superhero movies and shows. And so, over the years, more and more violent superhero shows have been made, some of which are actually very well written. And this video is going to take a look at the 5 most violent superhero shows that have ever been made. Harley Quinn. Easily the most violent animated superhero show that DC has ever made. Not that there's really that much competition. There is more blood and gore than ever before, including a lot of Joker murders, most which are just casual shootings with a handgun, and one amazing scene that sees Harley Quinn bite the Penguin's nose off and then stab him to death with a broken half of a baseball bat. Now that is one messed up scene. But it's just the tip of the iceberg really, as it's not just one scene that makes this show so violent, but the frequency with which violence occurs, and more importantly, the blatant casualness in which it occurs. And it does make perfect sense in the DC supervillain world. I mean, these supervillains are psychotics who've been locked up in Arkham because they're insane. So it makes sense that they would be this psychotic and violent. So in some respects, although this is a pretty wacky show, it's actually one of the more realistic portrayals of the superhero and supervillain community. Invincible. No drugs, no nudity, a little swearing here and there, and an absolute ton of gore. It's the gore that gives it the R rating, because this show is incredibly liberal with blood. Even the title credits at the beginning get splattered with more blood with each new episode. Superheroes have their necks stabbed, their heads crushed, their guts ripped out, and more people than you can count get Omni-Man's fist through their brains. He even cuts a few people in half. And quite a lot of their blood ends up on the floor. I mean, that's what makes this show so gory. It's not the actual violence. After all, we've seen a lot of violence in a lot of media and in a lot of superhero movies and TV shows. No, what makes these shows violent is that you actually see the consequences of that violence. Usually we just cut away and then we know they're dead, but we didn't actually see the gore, usually to keep the rating down. But in this show, they show you the consequences. They show you what would actually happen if you rip someone open, if you smash them apart. And so we see brains, blood and gore everywhere. In fact, if this show was live action, it would probably be the most gory superhero show ever made. In fact, it could be the most gory show ever made, period. Though the violence isn't so much glorified as it is used to create a sense of fear and horror, to show us just how terrifying it would be if superheroes really existed. Because Omni-Man, who is of course Superman, is unstoppable. He even damn near wipes out a whole planet of aliens who try to conquer Earth, but it's his planet to conquer, not theirs. And these aliens had a lot more advanced technology than the humans did. So this man is the very definition of unstoppable. The Boys. The main point of this show is just to show what could happen if people with the powers of gods actually existed, and how that power would corrupt and disconnect them from society to the point where they would treat the rest of us as disposable playthings. So needless to say, it's a very violent show, with Homelander frequently killing whoever the hell he wants for little to no reason, or just because he's bored, or in one case as a romantic gesture to his girlfriend to set the right mood for a little lovemaking, which is one of the weirdest scenes in this whole show, to be honest. Now, The Boys aims to show us that power corrupts, and that superheroes are the most powerful people in the world. Though for most of them, it's not so much about hurting humanity, it's more about drugs, sex and booze. But for some of them, mostly the more powerful superheroes, it's about pain for pleasure and blood for fun. Or just blatant incompetence, such as Marathon Man blasting a civilian to pieces because he wasn't looking where he was going when he was running at super speed. Basically, The Boys shows us that if gods really did live among mortals, then the mortals would suffer endlessly. Daredevil/Punisher. Now, since these shows share a universe and their stories do overlap in each other's episodes, I thought I'd count them together. Now, The Punisher is a show that is not afraid to show death or people being tortured. In fact, it's pretty much all this show is about. And since the star of this show is a mass murderer who has dedicated his life to killing criminals, well, you wouldn't really expect anything less. because you know you're in for something that is going to be breathtakingly violent. In fact, at least one person seems to die every episode on screen in a very violent manner, and the Punisher even tortures the closest thing that he has to a friend. But don't think of this as just a snuff film. There is still a strong narrative and good characters. The stories do actually vary between hunting down the person who killed the Punisher's family, dealing with everyday social injustices, or dealing with PTSD from ex-soldiers, which involves anything from a fistfight to improvised explosive vests and blowing up buildings. If you're looking for a variety buffet of violence, then this is the show for you. And when it comes to Daredevil, the scene that I always remember the most is when the hard-as-nails assassin betrays the Kingpin and tells the Daredevil all about him. And rather than face the gang lord's wrath, he impales himself through the eye and kills himself. It is an insanely brutal scene that comes out of nowhere in my opinion, and it really gets across the level of fear that the Kingpin commands. I mean, this guy was absolutely nuts and wasn't scared of anyone, but the mere mention of him getting some retribution from the Kingpin, and he instantly killed himself in an incredibly brutal manner. I mean, that's just crazy. And it is just one of many blood-filled scenes. And this was also one of the first superhero shows to really show us this level of violence. In fact, a lot of other violent superhero shows wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for this one. And as the seasons on Daredevil went on, they doubled down on that violence. In another memorable scene, the Punisher is being tortured by having a drill go through his foot, which must be absolute agony. Then it's revealed that he actually meant to get tortured because he wanted to give up information so the bad guys would be lured into a trap he's laid. And the bad guys take the bait and walk straight into a bomb that he has planted. And that is a truly mental thing for him to plan out. It's done all the time in comics, but to see it in real life, you can see just how utterly insane it is. A plan that involves you being tortured is not a good plan. Not at all. Although it does really give you a peek into the Punisher's suicidal mindset. Gotham. Now, since this show mainly followed homicide detective Jim Gordon, there are almost no episodes that don't involve at least one murder. In fact, most episodes involve half a dozen murders. But not just murder, there's also torture, stabbings, cutting off hands, and cutting the face off of Jerome's corpse, only for one of his acolytes to wear it like a mask. And this show not only had extreme violence, but it did it in a way that almost made sense. It still kept a rather wacky and cartoonish tone, but in a way that was actually needed in order to take the edge off the extreme violence. And that's really the beauty of this show. The violence is balanced with silliness and dressed up with novelty act crime to make it all a game, and thus more fun to watch. But the violence isn't the show's selling point at all. The violence is just the cherry on top of the bloody sundae. It's not the main draw, but it does add to the overall show, which is how violence should always be used in my opinion. Gore just for the sake of gore is kinda pointless. But this show made the violence a key part of the story, but not the only reason to watch the story, which in many respects is the reason that this show worked. And I also thought I'd give an honourable mention to the Umbrella Academy, which so closely made this list. This is a show that deals with the darker side of heroes, and this show shows us that being raised in a superhero world kinda just screws a person up, which isn't really that surprising, but knowing that it's a bad life and seeing that it's a bad life are two very different things. And for the most part, the violence on this show isn't actually too graphic. Well, actually that's not true. When violence does occur, it is quite graphic, it's just that most of the violence is quite spread out, which is actually the reason I rejected it, as the rest of the shows on this list have violence throughout them, not just spaced out sporadically. Although there is one scene which I do have to mention, and that is when the little child assassin kills a hotel room's worth of executives, in an absolutely beautiful scene as he teleports around committing absolutely gory, horrific and beautiful murders. But on the whole, the other shows on this list are far more violent, or at least that violence occurs more frequently. But what do you think? Are these the 5 most violent superhero shows? Or are there others that should have been on this list instead? Be sure to let us know in the comments. And I'd just like to quickly remind everyone that we have some merchandise available on our store, and to say thanks to all of you who have donated to the Needle Mouse Productions page on Patreon. And as always, thanks for watching, and feel free to subscribe, share, like, and comment.